As much as some people hate to train it, our conditioning, laterally, our cardio, is fundamental to everything that we do in life, certainly our health and our training. Many people conceptualize their conditioning as a pyramid with long, slow distance at the base and high intensity intervals at the peak. In this video, I'm going to discuss some simple progressive overload strategies that you can use to get more bang for your buck out of your conditioning training that will broaden the base, raise the height, and increase the total area of your cardiovascular pyramid so that you can derive even more significant benefits to your body composition, your overall health, and the other kinds of training that you enjoy. Now, to briefly go over the concept of progressive overloading, you've probably heard the story of Milo and the bull, where basically he was a kid, he had a calf, and as he grew, the bull grew, and he got stronger in order to continue to be able to hoist the bull overhead. The concept of progressive overload is basically we increase the stress, we adapt to the stress, we increase the stress, we adapt further, so on and so forth. And there are myriad ways to increase the stress besides just adding weight to the bar, although that is one way you can do so. And much like our resistance training, we can do the same with our cardio training as well. Let's take our base cardio, walking. Well, really our base cardio is just being alive, but in terms of movement, walking in of itself is not particularly stressful, and most people can walk a couple to several thousand steps a day without necessarily deriving too much of an adaptation from that. If we progressively increase the volume from, say, 5,000 to 9,000 steps, and then from 9,000 to 12,000, then from 12,000 to 15, and so on, as the stress increases, the stress volume that is, we should derive an adaptation from that. Likewise, we can increase the load. We could walk with a kit. We could walk with a rucksack. We could walk up an incline. We could walk through deep snow. So you get what I'm saying. There's a lot of different ways that you can progressively overload a thing. It's not necessarily just weight. It can be resistance. It can be volume. It can be time between successive iterations, like briefer rest periods, more training density. But now that we're clear on the concept of progressive resistance as it pertains to cardio, I want to share with you a study published pretty recently in 2023 in JSAMS by Bell et al. And they were trying to derive the impact of progressive overload on the proportion and frequency of positive cardiorespiratory fitness responders. This is a fancy way of saying, basically, if we do cardio and we get a training effect, is the training effect just an aspect of doing the cardio, or is it relative to how progressively we increased the cardio? In other words, does cardio derive an adaptive response similar to something like lifting would? Because if it does, and we can put numbers to that, then that's extremely beneficial to those of us trying to design cardio programs to derive specific outcomes, like improve certain health markers, increase VO2 max, so on and so forth. There's a couple of interesting findings that this study determined that I've derived anecdotally within my own training. First and foremost, this study seems to demonstrate, and I wholeheartedly believe this, that the more aerobically fit you get, the more frequency and longer duration training sessions you need in order to derive a training effect. Certainly for me, it does not feel like conditioning unless it's close to an hour in duration. Now that fact and then the next thing are what's going to drive the remainder of this discussion, and that's this. Quote, VO2 responder frequency is increased if exercise intensity is tightly regulated to the individual's anaerobic threshold rather than standardized heart rate-based prescription. Now, I've been saying this for years. What does this mean? It means that if you want to titrate your dose of progressive overload for your conditioning, you need to do so using your anaerobic threshold. What is your anaerobic threshold? Another term for your anaerobic threshold is your lactate threshold, and your lactate threshold is defined as the highest sustained intensity of exercise for which the measurement of oxygen uptake can account for the entire energy requirement. So in other words, how hard can you work and still use fat for fuel, still be in oxidative phosphorylation. This is where the infamous zone 2 of the 5-zone system comes into play, and the talk test. If you are conducting an activity, but you can still hold a labored conversation, so in other words, you can talk, but you're kind of panting, and the individual that is listening to you can tell that you are exercising, but the key here is that it's sustainable. That puts you at roughly just shy of 2 millimoles of blood lactate. And that talk test is generally accepted as the most accurate proxy for determining whether or not you're just shy of 2 millimoles blood lactate without laboratory equipment. So now that you've identified that value by sensation, let's put numbers to it. Look at the device that you're on, the treadmill, the bike, the rowing machine, and check out the wattage value. Get your weight in kilograms and divide your wattage by that. You should get an integer value that hopefully is north of 2 and probably under 5. That is your watts per kilogram metric, and that is the metric that you're going to use to progressively overload as you continue to train. Many researchers and physicians have gone on record saying that as long as you can get to 3 or above, that's generally representative of a good state of metabolic health. And if you can get to 4 or 5, your aerobic conditioning and mitochondrial health is extremely robust. So how do we use this to program progressive resistance for conditioning? Personally, I prefer to do this on the bike, and the reason being is because number one, it's a monostructural cyclical style of conditioning where you can do long and slow or sprint, and it's a device where you can increase and set the resistance level, so you have multiple ways in which to progressively overload distance, speed, and resistance of the pedals, mechanism, whatever it is that's generating the resistance against you. So you actually have to, it's almost like pedaling through molasses. So if you go back through my conditioning cardio playlist, I explain step by step how I do this on the Precor and LifeFitness bike. But real briefly, I set it to a resistance level that gets me at about 100 RPM and 1 mile in about 3 minutes and 20 seconds. So on the LifeFitness model, that's level 14. On the Precor model, that's level 10. Then how I currently structure my training is I cruise at my maximum sustainable wattage, my lactate threshold, my talk test level, until I get to 25 kilometers or 15 and a half miles. At which point at 25, 26, 27, 28, and 29 kilometers, I do a max wattage sprint, which usually takes about 10-15 seconds to get to, so it's kind of like a 15 on, 45 second off, 5x HIIT zone 5 interval training session on the tail end of my zone 2. So it ends up being a total of 30 kilometers, 25 of just coasting in zone 2, and then on the tail end, I have 5x of zone 5, so I have both the base building, which takes roughly 50 minutes of my training, and then 10 minutes of high intensity intervals at the end. This is essentially the inverse of how I do my strength hypertrophy training, where I do heavyweight lower reps like doubles and triples on the front end, and then afterwards do some down sets and rep it out, lower weight, higher volume for the hypertrophy benefits. This is currently how I structure my conditioning after about 3 years of building up to this point. 3 years specifically on the bike, that is. But what I would recommend for starters is to do at least 20 or 30 minutes of zone 2 on your implement of choice. The last 5-10 minutes or so implementing 3 to 6 brief sprint intervals. That way you can concurrently train the base and the top end of the pyramid, increasing the total area, in other words, your aerobic capacity, in a shorter time. And what you're going to notice, folks, is that talk test value, that's the base of your cardiovascular pyramid. That's going to start to widen, which is going to start pushing the high end, those sprint interval values up. Track, test, reassess, and when you feel up to it after a few weeks, push one or both ends a little bit harder. Progressive overload. And listen, walking is great. Continue to add to your step count, but we can do better than just moving around and burning calories. Try doing your cardio with a sense of purpose and add some progressive overload to it. You'll be surprised at just how quickly you derive a training effect. Stay in the fight, and thanks for watching.